Your father left you nothing but the dirt on his shoes. My mother sneered those words at me in front of 200 guests, holding up a will that supposedly gave my sister everything. The house, the business, all $4.8 million of it. Everyone stared at me like I was the failure, like I'd been erased. But while they were celebrating their inheritance gala, I already had the truth in my purse, a small brass key, to an offshore vault my father never told them about. Inside, the real will. And a signed confession that proved they'd forged everything. By the time the champagne bottles popped, so did the police sirens. Welcome to Hidden Secrets. Let me show you how my own mother ended the night in handcuffs. My name is Scarlett, and I grew up in the shadow of a sprawling estate in Charleston, South Carolina, a place where the humidity is thick with the scent of jasmine and the weight of old money. My father, Arthur, was a titan of the shipping industry, a man whose word was as solid as the iron on his docks. I was his right hand, the daughter who spent her summers learning the logistics of freight and the nuances of international maritime law. But in the eyes of my mother, Lydia, and my younger sister, Sloane, I was nothing more than a glorified bookkeeper. Sloane was the Charleston Rose, a debutante who had mastered the art of spending money she never earned, and Lydia was her ultimate architect. My mother lived for social standing, for the glittering galas at the yacht club, and for the hollow prestige of the Thorne family name. She viewed my father's rugged work ethic with a thinly veiled contempt, preferring the polished, idle charm that Sloane exhibited. The inciting incident occurred exactly 48 hours after my father's sudden passing from a heart attack. The house was still filled with the suffocating smell of memorial lilies and the hushed, performative whispers of the Charleston elite. I was sitting in the library, staring at the empty leather chair where my father used to drink his bourbon, when Lydia and Sloane walked in. They weren't wearing the expressions of grieving family members. They looked like they had just won a high-stakes poker game. Lydia stood at the head of the mahogany table, draped in custom-made black silk, and pulled a single, crisp sheet of paper from a silver folder. "Scarlett, dear," she began, her voice dripping with a sugary, false sympathy that made my skin crawl. "We know you've dedicated a lot of time to the company, but Arthur realized toward the end that the Thorne legacy needs a certain image. He signed a new will 3 weeks ago." She pushed the paper toward me. I read it, and for a moment, the world felt like it was tilting on its axis. The document stated that the entire estate, the shipping company, the Charleston mansion, the offshore holdings, and the $10 million trust was left entirely to Sloane. I was granted a severance of $50,000 and an order to vacate the estate within 30 days. I looked at the signature. It was a jagged, shaky version of my father's hand, witnessed by my mother's personal trainer and her favorite boutique owner. "This is impossible," I whispered, my voice trembling with a mixture of grief and pure, unadulterated shock. "Dad told me last month that I was to take over as CEO. He said the company was my birthright." Sloane laughed, a sharp, tittering sound that echoed off the book-lined walls. "Oh, Scarlett, you were always so literal. Dad just used you for free labor. He wanted me to be the face of the Thorne brand. You're just the help." The humiliation was surgical. Within hours, they had changed the codes to the company servers. I was locked out of the office I had spent 10 years building. Lydia had the house staff begin packing my things into cardboard boxes, placing them on the gravel driveway like trash waiting for pickup. The psychological toll was a heavy, bruising weight. I felt like my father had died twice, once in reality, and once through the character assassination my mother was performing. They told everyone at the yacht club that I had been disinherited for financial mismanagement, effectively blacklisting me from any other firm in the city. I sat on my suitcase in the humid South Carolina heat, watching Sloane pull out of the driveway in my father's vintage Mercedes, her hand draped casually over the steering wheel as if she hadn't just committed the ultimate theft. I was the displaced daughter, the girl who had given her life to a legacy that had just been stolen by a forged signature and a mother's toxic favoritism. But as I stared at the empty house, I remembered a small brass key my father had pressed into my hand during his final hospital stay. "When the storm comes, Scarlett," he had whispered, "look behind the chart of the Atlantic." The transition from a paralyzed victim to a cold-blooded strategist didn't happen overnight. It happened in a cramped, 2-star motel room on the outskirts of North Charleston, where the neon sign hummed with a persistent, buzzing rhythm that matched the headache behind my eyes. I spent the first 3 days in a state of sensory overload. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the smirk on Sloane's face and the calculating, predatory glint in my mother's eyes as she handed me that fraudulent will. The betrayal was a physical ache, a weight in my lungs that made every breath feel like a labor. But more than the loss of the money or the company, it was the psychological erasure that hurt. They were systematically deleting 28 years of my existence. Lydia had already started posting on social media, photos of her and Sloane toasting with vintage crystal, captioned, "New beginnings for the Thorne legacy, finally in the right hands." The arrogance of their victory was what eventually snapped me out of my grief. On the 5th day, I received a formal demand for return of property letter from a high-priced law firm I knew my father had never used. They weren't just satisfied with taking the estate. They wanted the pearl necklace my father had given me for my graduation and the limited edition watch he'd handed me on my 25th birthday. They were trying to strip me of every physical connection I had to the man who actually loved me. I realized then that my mother wasn't just greedy, she was malicious. She wanted to see me broken, to see me crawl back and beg for a seat at the table she had stolen. She viewed my competence as a personal insult to her own idle life, and Sloane was her weapon of choice. Sloane, meanwhile, was treating the shipping company like a personal piggy bank. I saw a notification on a shared business alert. She had already authorized a $500,000 marketing expense for a private jet to a fashion show in Milan. They were burning through my father's life's work with the reckless abandon of children playing with matches in a dry forest. The breaking point, the moment the last thread of familial loyalty snapped, happened when I went back to the estate one last time to retrieve a box of my father's old sea charts. I had a legal right to my personal effects, but when I arrived, the locks had been changed to high-security biometric scanners. I stood on the porch, the humidity of the South Carolina afternoon sticking my shirt to my back, and watched through the window as Lydia and Sloane hosted a consultation brunch with an interior designer. They were laughing as they pointed at my father's antique nautical maps, the ones he had used to teach me how to navigate the Cape of Good Hope. "Throw these in the incinerator," Lydia said, her voice carrying through the glass with chilling indifference. "They're dusty, they smell like old salt, and they don't fit the coastal chic aesthetic we're going for. I want this room to be a meditation lounge for Sloane." Watching those maps, my father's history, my childhood lessons being tossed onto a pile of trash was like a lightning strike to my soul. The grief vanished, replaced by a crystalline, predatory focus. I realized that if I didn't act, they would not only steal my future, but they would erase my father's past. I turned away from the house, my heart beating with a cold, rhythmic precision. I remembered the brass key. I remembered his dying words. "Look behind the chart of the Atlantic." He wasn't talking about the charts in the library. He was talking about the massive, framed 18th century map that hung in his private war room at the shipping docks, a place Lydia and Sloane hadn't bothered to visit because it smelled like diesel and work. My internal emotional struggle was over. I stopped being the daughter who wanted her mother's approval and became the woman who would ensure her mother's ruin. I understood the psychology of my enemies perfectly. They were arrogant because they thought they were smarter than me, and they were careless because they had never had to work for anything. They assumed that because they had the official will, the game was over. They didn't realize that Arthur Thorne was a man of contingencies. He had spent his life navigating treacherous waters and avoiding pirates. He knew exactly what kind of sharks he was married to. I drove to the docks at midnight. The shipyard was a forest of steel cranes and shipping containers, silhouetted against the moonlight. My old security badge still worked. Sloane was too lazy to have deactivated the secondary port access codes yet. I let myself into my father's private office. The air was cool and smelled of salt and aged paper. I walked to the massive map of the Atlantic. My hands were shaking as I felt along the heavy oak frame. There, hidden behind a decorative brass compass rose, was a tiny keyhole. I inserted the brass key. With a soft hydraulic hiss, a panel behind the map swung open. It wasn't just a safe, it was a reinforced, fireproof vault. Inside was a black leather binder and a digital drive. I opened the binder. The first page was a document titled, "The True and Final Will of Arthur J. Thorne." It was dated just 3 days before his heart attack. In it, he laid out everything. He had known Lydia was planning to forge a document. He had caught her taking photos of his signature while he was medicated. He had filmed her. The drive contained the footage. But more importantly, the vault contained the deed to a secret offshore trust in the Cayman Islands, worth an additional $10 million, which was left exclusively to me, along with a slayer clause that would legally strip Lydia and Sloan of even their basic spousal support if they were found to have attempted fraud against the estate. The mystery was solved, but the revenge was just beginning. I didn't take the documents to the police immediately. I knew that in the USA, a legal battle of this magnitude could be tied up in probate for years if I wasn't careful. I needed to let them dig their own graves first. I needed them to commit a crime so public, so undeniable, that no high-priced Charleston lawyer could save them. I sat in the dark office, the glow of the shipyard lights reflecting in my eyes, and began to draft the silent plan. I was going to let them have their gala. I was going to let them announce their new era. And then, I was going to sink their ship in front of the entire world. The silent plan was a masterclass in psychological warfare and forensic strategy. I knew that in the high-stakes world of South Carolina probate and maritime law, a direct confrontation in a lawyer's office would only lead to a decade of litigation. Lydia and Sloan had the estate's liquid cash to burn on billable hours, and I was currently living out of a suitcase. To win, I didn't just need the truth. I needed to orchestrate a point of no return, a moment where their fraud was so publicly and legally documented that the state would have no choice but to intervene with handcuffs. I moved back to the motel and transformed the small, laminate desk into a command center. I had the real will, the offshore trust documents, and most importantly, the digital drive containing the ghost evidence. Step 1 was the financial honeypot. I knew Sloan's primary motivation was immediate gratification. Through a proxy, an old college friend who worked as a high-end investment broker in Atlanta, I leaked information to Sloan about a massive, once-in-a-lifetime real estate acquisition in the Bahamas. I made it look like an exclusive opportunity that required a $2 million cash deposit within 10 days. As I expected, Sloan bit the hook. She didn't have $2 million in her personal account, which meant she had to dip into the Thorn Shipping corporate reserves, funds she was not legally authorized to touch without a certified probate decree. By doing this, she was moving from a civil inheritance dispute into the realm of embezzlement and interstate wire fraud. I sat back and watched the transaction alerts on the secondary server I still had access to. The trap was set. She was now a federal liability. Step 2 was the legal entrapment. I contacted my father's real attorney, a man named Sterling Vance who had been on vacation during the week of the funeral. I showed him the vault documents. Sterling was horrified, but he agreed to my tactical delay. "Scarlett," he whispered over a secure line, "if we file this now, they'll claim the vault document is the forgery. We need them to testify under oath that the first will is the only one." We coordinated with the South Carolina District Attorney's Office, specifically the White Collar Crime Division. We arranged for a probate verification hearing to be held at the estate, but I suggested a more public venue, the Thorn Shipping Centennial Gala. It was an event my mother was throwing to celebrate her takeover, and it was the perfect stage for a public execution of their reputations. Step 3 was the digital sabotage. I knew my mother had been using a specific boutique notary to verify the forged will. Through my private investigator, I discovered that this notary had a history of losing her logbooks for the right price. I didn't confront her. Instead, I had a subpoena issued for her digital backup records she didn't realize were being automatically synced to a cloud server managed by her franchise headquarters. We found the metadata for the forged will. It wasn't signed 3 weeks before my father died. It was created and digitally stamped 48 hours after his death. The timestamp was the smoking gun. It proved that Lydia hadn't just found a new will, she had manufactured one while my father's body was still in the morgue. The tension during this phase was almost unbearable. I had to remain invisible. I moved to a different motel every 2 nights, paranoid that Lydia's security, mostly hired thugs from a private firm, would find me. I watched from afar as Sloan began to liquidate my father's favorite assets. She sold his 1960s Boston whaler, the boat he had taught me to pilot, at a steep discount just to buy a pair of designer watches. Each time they sold a piece of my history, it felt like a fresh cut, but I used the pain to sharpen my resolve. I was building a legal fortress around them. Every penny they spent, every document they signed, and every lie they told to the press was being logged into a federal indictment file. The mystery of the offshore trust was the final piece of the puzzle. The $10 million in the Cayman account wasn't just money, it was a dead man's switch. My father had set it up so that if the main estate was ever contested, or if his death was deemed suspicious by a third party, the offshore funds would automatically trigger an independent forensic audit of the shipping company. By attempting to take the company, Lydia had inadvertently tripped the wire. An international auditing firm was already quietly digging into the books, and they were finding a decade's worth of Lydia's hush money, payments, and Sloane's gambling debts being laundered through the Thorne accounts. I spent the night before the gala in a state of icy, calculated calm. I had the original will in a weatherproof case. I had the digital drive in my pocket. I had the DA's office on speed dial. And I had a guest pass to the gala, courtesy of a disgruntled dock worker who had worked for my father for 40 years and hated what Sloane was doing to the company. The silent plan was no longer silent. The pieces were all on the board. Lydia and Sloane thought they were about to be crowned the queens of Charleston society. They didn't realize that the disinherited daughter was coming home, and I wasn't coming for an apology, I was coming for the throne. The tactical planning was complete. I had used the USA's complex web of maritime law, interstate banking regulations, and probate statutes to turn their inheritance into a prison cell. In Charleston, your name is your currency, and by the time the sun rose after the gala, the Thorne name would belong to me again, and theirs would be written in the police blotter. I stood on the battery overlooking the harbor, the salt air whipping my hair, and I felt my father's presence beside me. "The storm is here, Dad," I whispered. "And I'm the one bringing the thunder." The Thorne Shipping Centennial Gala was a spectacle of opulence and hubris. The estate grounds were transformed into a dreamscape of twinkling fairy lights, draped white silk, and ice sculptures carved into the shape of anchors. Every powerful family in the Lowcountry was there, governors, judges, and shipping magnates, all sipping vintage champagne and eating beluga caviar on my father's dime. Lydia looked like a queen in a gown of midnight velvet, her neck draped in the very pearls she had tried to steal from my jewelry box. Sloane was at her side, loud and vacuous, bragging to a group of investors about the new direction of the company. They looked invincible. They looked like they had successfully buried the truth under a mountain of Charleston charm and forged paper. I entered through the catering entrance, disguised in a server's uniform, my heart thundering with a cold, rhythmic precision. I carried a silver tray, but tucked inside my jacket was the black leather binder and the digital drive that would end their reign. I watched from the shadows as Lydia took the stage in the grand ballroom. The room went silent as she raised her glass. "Arthur would have been so proud," she cooed into the microphone, her voice a masterclass in performative grief. "To see his legacy continue through the strength of his family. We are here to announce that Thorne Shipping is officially expanding, under the brilliant leadership of my daughter, Sloane." As the room erupted in applause, I signaled Sterling Vance, my father's real attorney, who was standing near the sound booth. He nodded. Suddenly, the upbeat jazz music cut to a jarring silence. The large projection screens, which had been showing a slideshow of family memories, carefully edited to exclude me, flickered and died. A low, distorted hum filled the ballroom. Lydia's smile faltered. "What is the meaning of this?" she hissed, looking toward the AV crew. Then the screens flared back to life. It wasn't a photo of a gala. It was a grainy, high-definition video from my father's private vault. The date and timestamp were visible, 48 hours after Arthur Thorne's death. The room gasped. On the screen, Lydia was clearly visible in my father's study, hunched over his desk with a light box. She was carefully tracing his signature onto a document. Sloane was standing over her, holding a glass of wine, laughing. "Make the sea more shaky, Mom." Sloane's recorded voice rang out through the ballroom's premium speakers. "He was supposed to be dying, remember?" The silence that followed was so thick it felt like the ocean had rushed into the room. Lydia went ashen, her hand trembling so violently that her champagne glass shattered on the stage. I stepped out from behind the pillars, shedding the server's jacket to reveal the black dress I had worn to my father's funeral. I walked down the center aisle, the crowd parting like the Red Sea. "The meaning, Mother," I said, my voice amplified by the still active microphone, "is that dead men do tell tales, especially when they know they're being hunted by wolves." I reached the stage and handed the black binder to the man standing in the front row, the chief of police for the city of Charleston, who had been invited by Sterling Vance under the guise of an honorary guest. "Chief," I said, my voice steady and cold, This is the original notarized will of Arthur Thorne, found in his private vault. Along with it, you will find a forensic audit detailing $5 million in corporate embezzlement committed by Sloane Thorne over the last 10 days and proof of a criminal conspiracy to forge a legal instrument. The hidden secrets were no longer hidden. As the chief opened the binder, a team of plainclothes officers moved in from the perimeter of the ballroom. In the USA, the legal system can be slow, but when a crime involves a $100 million shipping company and federal wire fraud, the response is a hammer. Lydia Thorne, Sloane Thorne, the chief announced, his voice echoing off the high ceilings, "You are under arrest for forgery, grand larceny, and embezzlement." The public humiliation was absolute. Sloane began to scream, a shrill, panicked sound that stripped away her debutante facade, while Lydia simply collapsed into a chair, her eyes vacant as she realized her Rose of Charleston was about to be a felon. The very people who had been toasting them moments ago now pulled back in disgust, capturing the arrest on their phones. The new era of Thorne shipping had lasted exactly 40 minutes. The legal fallout was a landslide. Because of the Slayer clause, in the real will, Lydia and Sloane were not only stripped of their inheritance, but were also held liable for every penny they had spent from the company coffers. The offshore trust I had unlocked provided the funds for a team of forensic accountants to dismantle their web of lies. Lydia was eventually sentenced to 15 years for the forgery and conspiracy, and Sloane received 8 years for her role in the embezzlement. They went from a Charleston mansion to a concrete cell in a federal penitentiary, their names becoming a cautionary tale in the maritime industry. I moved back into the estate the following month. The first thing I did was fire the meditation consultant and restore my father's library. I put the nautical charts back on the walls, the ones he had used to teach me that a storm is just a test of a ship's hull. I took over as CEO of Thorne Shipping, not because I was the image they wanted, but because I was the leader the company needed. Under my direction, we expanded our green energy shipping lanes and became a global leader in ethical logistics. I moved on with a quiet, powerful confidence. I don't go to many galas anymore. I prefer the salt air of the docks and the steady hum of the cranes. I am Scarlett Thorne, and I learned that an inheritance isn't just about money or property, it's about the integrity of the person who built it. I protected my father's legacy, and in doing so, I found my own. The estate is no longer a place of secrets, it's a house of truth. And every time I look at the chart of the Atlantic, I know that my father is finally at peace, knowing the helm is in the right hands.